All right, so after spending a little over a week in Libya investigating prisons funded by the European Union where migrants have been reportedly held, tortured, and even killed, the reporter working on this story, a man named Ian Urbina, was himself captured by armed men claiming to be from the Libyan intelligence service. He was detained for 6 days, during which he was beaten, interrogated, and placed in an isolation cell. In a New Yorker piece, he writes that when armed men burst into his hotel room, quote, they placed a hood over my head, kicked and punched me, and stepped on my face, leaving me with 2 broken ribs, blood in my urine, and damage to my kidneys. Then they dragged me from the room. After lobbying from the State Department and the Dutch Foreign Service, he and his reporting team were ultimately and thankfully released. That reporter joins me now. Ian Urbina is an investigative journalist and the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a nonprofit journalism organization based in Washington, D.C. that focuses on environmental and human rights concerns at sea globally. He has just published that groundbreaking new piece I was telling you about with The New Yorker and NBC News. Ian, it's good to see you. I'm glad that you made it out of there safely, you and your team. What a harrowing experience that must have been. Just tell us a little bit about that. What was your experience being captured by these armed guards? Describe what you went through during your detention, and were you told what crimes you were being detained for?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it was a harrowing experience, not one we expected to occur. In some ways, it gave us a distinct insight to what migrants experience in a much more intense level. The crime that we were charged with was essentially practicing journalism in Libya. The Libyan intelligence service said that they thought we were spies for the CIA, and also, even if we were reporters, we shouldn't be trying to embarrass Libya by focusing on how the country is dealing with migrants.
I know that you, in this story, tell the account of Aliou Kandeh, a migrant who unfortunately was killed in that El Mabani prison. Tell us about him and the conditions he suffered under in this facility. How did you uncover what happened to him?
Yeah, so Aliou Kandeh was in some ways a traditional, typical, climate migrant, 28-year-old farmer from Guinea-Bissau, West African country, who wanted to try to provide for his family by making his way to Europe. He began a long, arduous trip through the Saharan desert, ends up getting in a migrant raft, trying to cross the Mediterranean, sent back to shore, captured by the Libyan Coast Guard, and put in this prison where ultimately, after 2 months, there's a fight between migrants and the guards at the prison opened fire on the migrants through a window, and Aliou Kandeh was shot in the neck and killed. I'd heard about this killing, which happened a couple of weeks prior to my arrival, and just thought it would be worth investigating how he killed and in what ways, if any, he was typical of many of the migrants that end up in this prison.
I know that a friend of Aliou Kandeh described to you the isolation room, which was punishment for prisoners, where, quote, guards tied the hands of detainees to a rope suspended from a steel ceiling beam and beat them. It's not so bad seeing a friend or a man yelling as he's being tortured, Sumahoro said, but seeing a 6-foot-tall man beating a woman with a whip. Your piece documents reports of beatings, sexual assaults, killings. Has there been any kind of formal investigation, particularly on the part of the EU?
Yeah, I mean, in the last 5 years alone, there have been a half dozen reports, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN, about the brutalities in this gulag, this sort of EU-funded prison system that exists in Libya. So it's not new to point out just the extent of violence and extortion and rape and occasionally murder. But the EU hasn't done a whole lot to actually reckon with their role in funding the very mechanisms that send so many migrants to the prisons. And often the EU complains about, this is really the Libyan government's responsibility to clean up behavior in the prison and sort of shrug. But the EU is the one sending most of the migrants to these prisons.
Yeah, and I know that in your piece you also described this cemetery where Kandeh is now buried, and you have this incredible drone footage of the cemetery where many of Libya's dead migrants are unfortunately buried in unmarked graves. And yet, as these images go around the world, as your reporting is shared, migrants will continue to make this journey. Has this brutal system of imprisonment had any impact on the number of migrants attempting this dangerous crossing?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's the sort of system that the EU has imposed has been effective at the goal of stopping migrants from arriving to Europe. So it's a success in that way. It's a dire failure from a human rights perspective. You know, the death rate of migrants attempting to cross has gone up. And what happens to the migrants that are returned to Libya has only gotten worse. So if you measure it by those metrics, it's a, abject failure. And on a larger level, if you think about the fact that, 150 million climate migrants are expected to sort of shift position over the next 2 decades, the notion that the EU is going to outsource its migration problem to a failed state, namely Libya, and that is something that can survive the tests of law and ethics over the next decade is a really foolish one.
Yeah, and I also wanted to note that you write about Europe's commitment to anti-migrant programs in Libya remains unshaken. Last year, Italy renewed its memorandum of understanding with Libya. Since this past May, with support from the EU, it has spent at least $3.9 million on the Libyan Coast Guard. What kind of pressure would it take for the EU to scale back this operation of theirs? Does that seem likely to you in the future? Is there a concerted international effort by human rights organizations or perhaps elsewhere at the United Nations to try and get the EU to reverse course than what it's doing now?
I mean, there is. There's a lot of pressure from within the EU, even from parliamentarians, as well as only 2 weeks ago, there was a coalition of lawyers in Europe that filed papers to the International Criminal Court seeking to get the ICC to investigate the detention system, which the UN itself has described as sort of engaged in crimes against humanity. So there are strong voices from within Europe and elsewhere trying to pressure the EU to rethink its role in this sort of abusive system. At the same time, there are strong forces, xenophobic forces largely, that are attempting to sort of continue with this path and sort of build this invisible wall across the Mediterranean to block migrants from arriving to Europe. So, the jury's out as to what will happen, but there is real resistance.